This is an assault on free speech. This was the attempt to silence with violence, not just to silence Charlie permanently, but as I mentioned, to scare other conservatives and other Americans and other people around the world from speaking up. I'm not okay with the government deciding it's going to crack down on what it decides is, quote, hate speech, regardless of if it's targeting people that I agree with or people I disagree with. But call their employers, from the Vice President of the United States sitting in the chair that Charlie Kirk previously held on his show in its first broadcast after this tragedy, I think was way beyond the pale. Like, it's absolutely inappropriate. This cannot be seen as a left versus right issue because the words left and right are not sufficiently clear to operate that way, and it does needlessly and recklessly politicize something that needs to be handled with extreme clarity and discernment.
Hello and welcome to UnHerd. So cancel culture is something we have spoken a lot about on this channel over the past 5 or more years, and usually those cancellation efforts have come from the political left. I would say we've kind of been at the forefront of trying to argue against it and trying to appeal to a more free speech based world where people should say what they like, and if you don't like it, argue against them. Well, in the horrific aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, some commentators are saying that something like a cancel culture of the right is developing. Lists are being drawn up of professionals, people in any kind of position of responsibility who have said anything inappropriate, appearing to revel or celebrate in the death of Charlie Kirk, and those people are being systematically handed over to authorities. Many of them, across many different professions, are already losing their jobs. Here to try and understand this with us and see whether the so-called woke right is finally in evidence is James Lindsay, the commentator and longtime friend of the show. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Freddie.
So you have really made quite a lot of noise on social media. I would say you are one of the biggest voices on the issue of the so-called woke right, calling out what you see as illiberal moves on the right of the political spectrum. And the first question has to be, do you feel vindicated in the past week? I mean, what are the things you've seen in response to the very sad and tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk that have worried you?
I would say that probably the biggest sign, I actually have been very cautious with what I've engaged with regarding Charlie in the past week, very, I guess, deliberate. Charlie was a fairly close friend of mine, so this has been, somewhat personal on my end as well. The texts that I'm getting, people are sending me texts. You were right about everything. You were right about everything. And that may be the case. I've been feeling actually quite vindicated for months. So this boiling over emotional reaction in the wake of grief is a sign or a signal, but it's I don't think it's the best one yet. But certainly there have been people who are very opportunistic trying to take advantage of this to drive the conservative movement or MAGA in a very radical direction.
Yeah, I think it's worth just saying right at the top of this interview, as you said, Charlie was a friend of yours, and extremely traumatized reaction to such a horrible act of violence is completely understandable. More than understandable, it would be the normal thing. So no part of what you're saying is to condemn people who are absolutely enraged and very troubled by this.
That's absolutely right. Grief, especially in the face of a traumatic and tragic and horrific, actually is the right word, I guess, here, incident, is totally understandable. Anger, fear, despair. When they take one of your best in a violent way for, little more than speaking and challenging people in their thinking, it's enraging. It's also terrifying. The day that Charlie was shot last Wednesday, I probably fielded 5 or 6 calls from people I know who, are on what you might call the speaker circuit, and they're terrified. Do I cancel all of my speeches? Do I cut out public events, inside versus outside? What's safe? How are we going to proceed? So there's a lot of very big emotions that are all totally appropriate. What we have to do, as was written about in the classics, as Plato wrote about, was that we have to remember that our desires and our passions have to be tamed by reason, or else we're going to end up having some wild horse drive our chariot in the ditch, as the metaphor goes. On social media, I've primarily been trying to, focus on things that are positive, the people who are shocked and changing their mind, the government officials who are taking positive steps. What I'm kind of realizing very clearly is that, there's, to put it in very stark terms, darkness and there's light. And if you stare into the light, you can find a path. And if you stare into the darkness, it will make you crazy. And so I'm trying to bring people to look at the light, to set a course by the light, and to stop doom scrolling, as they call it. I saw a great meme where it shows, I think that Babylon Bee put it out, but I'm not positive. It says something like Gandalf warns Saruman the Wise to stop doom scrolling in the Palantir. And that's kind of exactly the vibe that I'm afraid of on social media right now.
Let's try and think through the kind of philosophical steps, because I think that is helpful. So people on the right now are completely correct to see the assassination of someone who made speech interactions their main job an assault on free speech. So the fact, that violent act itself is, of course, an attack on liberalism, attack on free speech, an attack of all of the things that you talk about every day. That first step is impossible to argue with.
Yeah, I fully agree. And it's what we do with that matters, right? So this is an assault on free speech. This was the attempt to silence with violence, not just to silence Charlie permanently, but as I mentioned, to scare other conservatives and other Americans and other people around the world from speaking up. I've heard and seen a lot of the kind of very vile celebration that, is dominantly coming from the left. And a lot of it says stuff like, Charlie ran his mouth and somebody answered with a rifle. And this is a completely wrong attitude, right? But the first step that people are taking is accurate. They're understanding correctly. Their emotions are reflecting what they're actually seeing, and their political thought is, in many ways, the first step of appropriately assessing what they're seeing. The problem, in other words, is real, and the problem is significant, and the problem is beyond being able to be ignored. We can't, as some people are saying, just continue on where we, don't do anything about this. But the question becomes, what do we do about it?
So let's answer that, or try to. So what you've just described, which is that there are lots of people, ordinary people, people in positions of authority, or just random people on social media who have celebrated the assassination of Charlie Kirk, or in some way justify it, make light of it. Now, what is the correct way to treat those people who have done that? Should that be protected by free speech arguments, or should steps be taken against them? Where do you draw the line when faced with that kind of reaction?
The line is challenging to draw, so I, again, commiserate with the people that are falling on the wrong side of it. But the fact is, there's a lot of things. First of all, speech, especially in the U.S., is very strongly protected. We have very narrow criteria by which somebody's engaging, as far as legal speech goes, in incitement to violence or threats. None of that, of course, can be tolerated. And I do think that, we're right to investigate incitement to violence, threats, and so on.
But celebrating the death of someone you intensely dislike, or whose political opinions you don't agree with, is not incitement to violence. There
is a fine line there. There is a fine line, because if it's like, the flavor of the celebration is more of this, then there could be some elements of that. Certainly, I don't think that, polite and decent society, regardless of which side of the aisle they're on, and there are people waking up on the left and saying this, I dislike everything Charlie Kirk stands for, and yet I can't conscience this. People should not be welcoming of those opinions. People should be publicly challenging those opinions. And especially when somebody's in a position of, this is kind of the crucial question, do we fire people who are doing this publicly? Certainly in the cases where somebody is within a position where the public depends on them for trust, this is a real question. And I think employers have the right and should exercise the right to do something about it. A doctor, a teacher, a government official, something like this, celebrating political violence and the assassination of somebody, is somebody that the public counts on and trusts to do their job in an unbiased way. And to have this kind of a public celebration, whatever you do in private, might be ugly and evil and awful or whatever, but to put it in public when the public depends on being able to trust you for something important like medical service or education or with their children and their children's minds, as we're seeing teachers. This is a real question. And in my opinion, those people should be relieved of the duties because they're demonstrating their inability to behave responsible in the capacity that they are.
It would still have to have quite a high bar, wouldn't it? I mean, a distasteful joke about Charlie Kirk, however horrendous you may find that, it's quite tough to see that as something that you, if you're otherwise good doctor, that you should be relieved of your position for. Or where do you agree with that? I mean,
I do.
How high should the bar be?
Well, I mean, certainly, anything that's like he deserved it or there should be more of this they've cleared the bar. There's another element to this as well, but that other element is that the emotional argument that we're appealing to the right cuts both ways. There are people who are in this moment that are celebrating this who are going to have a turn of conscience in the coming days or weeks. And not to say that they're extended total grace, because they are accountable, they have agency, and some lines can be crossed. And they should not be crossed, but they are possible to cross. And once they have been crossed, there does have to be this kind of accountability. But the bar should be fairly high. But above that line, the response should be clear and unequivocal that we're not going to tolerate people who are in significant positions of public trust to express these kinds of views, hold to these kinds of views, celebrate in public, and maintain their position of public trust. It's not to say they need to be excommunicated from society, but how do you trust somebody with your children who's celebrated a political assassination?
So you don't then think that this is actually just a kind of the woke right in action. I mean, the atmosphere that has been prevalent from the political left for years has been one where a single ugly statement on social media, no matter how far in your past, was enough to organize a kind of cancellation and could end up with your career being destroyed. And most people on the political right have found that to be really unpleasant. It allows no room for forgiveness. It allows no ability to have a more relaxed kind of conversation if you think every one of your utterances will be pored over by employers or government agencies. Does that not exert a chilling effect on free speech, even if you're trying to make sure there's a high bar to cross?
Yes, but at the same time, these employers, if it's a school or a hospital, have a responsibility to the people they serve. So they have to make their decisions, and they have to make their decisions well. So when you said, this isn't just the woke right, that is correct. It's not just the woke right. And often this is how this works, is that there's this true space and there's this ugly space that are mixing together to make things ambiguous and hard to tell apart. But there is a woke right campaign. There are people who are, literally publishing things about counting the scalps of the people that they got fired, that their goal is to find, say, 500,000 people. I mean, that's how you organize a purge. You set a quota and then go for it. There are people who are looking for every single possible, off-color remark that was made, which is not clearly some necessarily disgusting thing, and campaigning not just to have them, possibly lose their job, which is on one set of terms up to their employer actually, but pressuring those employers, and then also just going after people with like vicious social media mobs. And this mob behavior is fundamentally a woke behavior. The mob has no logic, it has no restraints, it has no limiting principles, and anybody who tries to articulate a limiting principle into the mob will find themselves at the end of the mob's bayonets.
Right, so just to spell this out then, for a kind of sober employer to consider particularly egregious cases of celebrating or invoking further violence in relation to Charlie Kirk, you would think is acceptable and proper. But for independent third-party actors to start trying to draw up long lists of people who have said inappropriate things and deliver them either to employers or authorities, or mobs to form on social media to try and do that work, makes you feel uncomfortable and you think is not the sign of a free society.
Right. Let me give you two examples, actually. So one example is what happened immediately after Charlie Kirk was shot. The internet sleuths decided that this person named Sky something or another was the murderer. And this person had God only knows what level of opprobrium brought down on them, because the internet decided, outside of any official investigation, outside of anything, that this person was guilty and therefore had to be held as such. But this person turns out not to have been guilty. Maybe there was some conspiracy. I don't know. I doubt it. But the fact is that there was no evidence whatsoever. So this is one behavior, this jumping on. This happens every time something happens that's huge and bad. You have, people on the internet who decide to go do their work, and then there's basically the doxing and accusation of some innocent. And this is absolutely insane witch hunt stuff. The second example, this is, I think, the single most chilling thing that I saw. There was a teacher in Canada who played the video to her classroom of 10 and 11-year-olds of Charlie being shot, which is, of course, horrendous and horrific. And my opinion is that person should be relieved of the job that they obviously weren't able to do responsibly. And this person has been put on leave pending an investigation, which is the process in a free society. There's going to be some kind of, an action, putting on leave, then there's going to be an investigation, and then the decision will be made pending the investigation, which hopefully will be swift, but also judicious and clear. And what happened is this gets posted by maybe NBC News, some large news account, and I read through the comments under it, and it's just a raft of people saying, "Give us the teacher's name. Give us the teacher's name." And it's like, no, holy crap, no, it is not in your hands. I mean, I get it. The system's not working great and perfectly in many regards, but holy crap, do not hand over names to the mob that have a lot of scary tools at their disposal, not just to ruin lives, but to threaten them or to put people in mortal danger.
Okay, let me ask a couple of further examples to try and get the outline right. So what about professions where their public statements aren't relevant to what they're doing? So there's been a lot of examples with airlines, for example. Pilots in a number of leading airlines in the US have been suspended or sacked post Charlie Kirk for things they've said in relation to him. Is that right? I mean, do you care whether the pilot who is safely navigating you through the sky has ugly opinions about politics? Or is that now somehow beyond the realm of investigation?
I mean, these are, like I've said all along, these are literally case-by-case bases. And I think that, when there are particularly egregious statements, it would be good for people to be made aware of that, maybe specifically the employers, and to let the employers make the decisions. There are a lot of people that are getting caught up in this same kind of thing for stupid but largely innocuous statements. So it depends on the level of how outrageous and egregious it is. I mean, a pilot obviously doesn't necessarily interact with the people on the plane, but he does have the list of the people flying, and so he is in the public trust. So if he thinks that there's this political test for whether or not the people on his plane are valid, then you may have a significant problem.
Okay, what about private messages versus public messages? Because quite a few of the case studies that have come up in the last 7 days have concerned group chats that were still private, where people have been saying these ugly things. I mean, we've got here in the UK the case of the president of the Oxford Union, a famous old debating society. The big public debate now is whether he should be relieved of his post. I don't think he's even started yet, technically. But that was things said in a private forum. Would you defend that? I mean, would you defend people being able to say whatever they like in a private forum?
I generally do draw a pretty strong line between public and private. I do think that there is some reasonable right to privacy that people have. I know that, there are even apps like Signal and Telegram that people tend to defer to specifically so that they have fewer possibilities of prying eyes on what is being said. And so there is some reasonable expectation of privacy. But on the other hand, there is also the fact that people will leak them, and so every case you bring up for me is going to have the same exact line is, what was said, how egregious was it? Sometimes the way that these things came out is inappropriate or untoward, but once it's out, it's also out.
And also, which of us has not said stupid things in private messages with friends? I'm sure you have. I'm sure I have.
Yeah, everybody does.
It would be a horrific world if everything you ever said privately could be grounds for dismissal or worse.
I mean, there are lines there like that echo back to Soviet Union, where the KGB would bug people's houses if they thought they're of any possible interest to, state interests. And so it's been put into all of our own hands to become the panopticon that's constantly spying on our neighbors and constantly engaging in snitch culture. There is this question, though, of public stature. The president of the debate union, the Oxford Union, is a man of public stature if he takes this role, steps into this role, as he's been elected to do. And I can see why people that would be in those chats would be concerned about him expressing opinions of that kind. And then that's a matter of private betrayal. But the attitude that, like, let's go scour the world to find everything that spoke ill of this man who was our hero and who was one of our leaders, or some people are saying generals in the culture war, the scour the world to purge it of evil is the woke impulse that I'm mostly concerned about.
So what examples of that have there been? I mean, who is scouring the world? I mean, what are the specific things that people close to the administration or their outriders have said or done in the last 5 or 7 days that have most worried you?
Well, I mean, again, I'm being very delicate with what I'm engaging with on social media, given the personal aspect of all this for me. The fact is, like, I saw, this one account claiming, we've got however many, we have to get to 500,000 or whatever. And somebody calls this account out, and then Tim Pool jumps in. Tim Pool's not a small media figure in the kind of alt media space. And it's like he read out of the woke left playbook as if we weren't all here 5 years ago when the BLM stuff and the Antifa stuff were going on. And he said, it's not cancel culture, it's retribution. I mean, at least the left had the common sense to say it's accountability, which sounds good. Like, no, it's just retribution. So there are disturbing calls from large platforms that what needs to happen now is something far more sweeping, based in a spirit of vengeance and retribution rather than in a spirit of justice.
Let me throw another couple of examples at you, if I may. Attorney General Pam Bondi, she vowed in an interview to target hate speech. Now, this is a concept which Charlie Kirk himself has disavowed. He said when he was alive that there is no such thing as hate speech. It was a concoction, an invention of the left. And yet here we have the Attorney General saying, quote, there's free speech and then there's hate speech, and there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie in our society, we will target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech.
The most concerning thing here for me is that my attorney general doesn't know the First Amendment and doesn't stand by it. Like, how do you become attorney general of the United States and not know the First Amendment? But just in case she happens to watch, Madam Attorney General Pam Bondi, repeat after me: incitement to violence. Incitement to violence. That's the word you mean instead of hate speech, which is already illegal. So there's already a legal statute against the thing that I hope she means. Hate speech is non-existent. It is a arbitrary, vague category that people use to criminalize or punish people who say things that they hate. We've known this for years. This hasn't changed. It's extremely concerning that she's not clear on this. I think I know what she means, but because I can only say I think I know what she means because of the words that she used, it's a very concerning development. I'm not okay with the government deciding it's going to crack down on what it decides is, quote, hate speech, regardless of if it's targeting people that I agree with or people I disagree with.
J.D. Vance, hosting the Charlie Kirk show yesterday, said to his audience, call them out, and hell, call their employer. We don't believe in political violence, but we do believe in civility. He was encouraging people to snitch or to dob in people who have said inappropriate or disgusting things around this. Is that too far for you? Should the Vice President be doing that?
And it's too far for me, not just that it's too far in and of what it is. J.D. Vance is the Vice President of the United States. We were especially horrified during the outbreak of violence in 2020 following the death of George Floyd. We were completely outraged to see people like Kamala Harris, who became vice president later that year, or actually early the next year, come out and say that she supported what they were doing and to run a bailout fund for them and all of this. So it's absolutely beyond the pale for the vice president of the United States. Our president seems to be doing a fairly good job. The vice president of the United States to come out and encourage this kind of behavior when he should be, in my opinion, calling for a moment of reflection for the nation and civility. Yes, draw clear lines. Yes, clear boundaries. Yes, a civic norm of strongly opposing political violence and voicing the fact that you oppose political violence and that you are aghast and upset about people who are engaging in it, but call their employers, from the Vice President of the United States sitting in the chair that Charlie Kirk previously held on his show in its first broadcast after this tragedy, I think was way beyond the pale. Like, it's absolutely inappropriate.
A lot of the rhetoric has also been that this came from the political left. There are terrorist cells, equivalent of terror cells in the political left, that have been allowed to form for way too long. People are thinking of Antifa and equivalent organizations. And the mood seems to be that the proper reaction to this assassination is to go after those groups and shut them down once and for all. Do you support that? Or are you worried that by framing it as a right versus left issue, the administration is politicizing its entire government in a way that hasn't been done before?
The answer to your question with the or was both. I do support the idea that I do believe there are terrorist operating cells within various political factions. Many of them are left-oriented that have escaped proper investigation and proper handling for a very long time. We all remember when Joe Biden said Antifa doesn't exist, it's just an idea, and how galling that was after everything they had just put our country through, not just in 2020, but also for the previous 5 to 10 years. But on the other, so that should be investigated. That should be looked into, and the FBI is doing that, and I think that's a tremendous credit to them. But on the other hand, you're also right. This is not as much as, whether it's, the rhetoric we're seeing online, whether it's Matt Walsh who's decided to draw this hard line about it. This cannot be seen as a left versus right issue because the words left and right are not sufficiently clear to operate that way. And it does needlessly and recklessly politicize something that needs to be handled with extreme clarity and discernment. Terrorist activity should be investigated, busted up, whatever the deal is that the right language is. However, to make this a left-right issue neglects the fact, and I'm not playing a both sides argument, but it neglects the fact that the line of evil can cut through any person. There are radicals on the right who are scary too. I don't think they're as numerous. Then there's this idea of, well, why is it the left, the left, the left? Well, it's because of a weird quirk. Why do we even use the word left? Not to get too deep, but it's because of a weird quirk of the French Revolution, where the Jacobins, who are radical revolutionaries, an identifiable group, sat to the left of the president in the National Assembly at the start of the French Revolution. So we said that their philosophy is left. Their philosophy is leftism. And then we split the entire political universe into two pieces, left and right, and then ascribed to all of the left, the left half of that political division, this idea that they're all like Jacobins or Bolsheviks or Maoists, when in fact they're not in the political terminology. But leftism is the philosophy of Jacobinism and Bolshevism and Maoism. And on the other hand, we took up this weird idea that whatever we call the right, just by these two strange buckets from a quirk of history, the right is that which opposes the left, which therefore opposes Bolshevism and Jacobinism and Maoism. And these terms are just so unclear for what we're after. Domestic terrorism, international terrorism, it is in the duty of our state governments, the United States government in this case, to investigate those things, to identify where those threats are, and to do something about them. And part of the reason we're here, and part of the reason that Charlie got murdered, is because for 10 years we have not investigated Antifa cells as potential terrorist threats or whatever the right designation happens to be for them. So I take both. Framing this as left versus right misses the point that it's actually radical, violent, militant groups that actually need to be investigated for what they are, without the left-right rhetoric in these two political boxes that miss the fact that one of the political boxes shares a name because of a quirk of history, right, with a philosophy.
And I would add, we don't yet know about the motivations of the shooter. Especially, we don't know to what extent he was or wasn't in some kind of cell or, extreme group, or whether he was more of a loner who was just, we just don't know yet. So it seems premature. One thing I would ask you, though, is to observe that there are voices calling for violence on the right as well. And that's why the framing is difficult. And frankly, Elon Musk, perhaps one of the most powerful voices associated with President Trump, came over here via video link this past weekend to address a crowd of 100,000 plus protesters in London and said, if this continues, violence is going to come to you. You will have no choice. Whether you choose violence or not, violence is coming to you. You either fight back or you die. That's the truth, I think. To me, that is encouraging the idea that violence is either an inevitable or necessary part of the political struggle and is supremely irresponsible. What say you to that?
I mean, he's very frequently the instigator in chief. My observations of Elon over the past year to year and a half, and I understand where he's coming from too, if it's all just prima facie that he's, a guy dealing with the world. But a lot of what he's done is this kind of escalation and incitement. It's always pouring gasoline on some fire or another. I understand that what actually changed him politically in 2024 was that he became of the belief, whether it's true or not, and it probably is at least mostly true, that if Kamala Harris won the election, that because of his activities that he'd engaged in with buying X, with political activity toward Trump, etc., that they were going to destroy him. They would take down his businesses. They might put him in mortal danger, even with all the resources he has as, the world's richest man, to deal with that. And he became radicalized around this idea of a desperate fear. And when you become that way, you think in those terms and you speak through that trauma and you bring that to what's happening. But that's not the most sober voice. I mean, in law, we know that if you were going to advocate for a new piece of legislation, you don't let a primary victim write the legislation. Just like you don't let a primary beneficiary write the legislation. We understand why those are bad ideas. So you want to allow victims and beneficiaries both to weigh in on what the legislation should be, but you want more sober minds making the decisions. And so I don't like how he pours gasoline on virtually everything. He's actually joined in this chorus of, it's left versus right, and the right must unite around I don't know what, in order to fight the left. It seems that we're uniting around the idea, which is fanciful, that every person left of center wants us all dead and would celebrate our deaths, which is simply not true. I've seen so much, not enough, but so much contrition from people left of center about what just happened last week with Charlie, that I know it's not true, that every one of them is enthusiastically, celebrating this. And this is why I said, if we stare at the darkness, it will make us go crazy. So supposing Elon is just a guy who became scared, he's stared at the darkness, and now he's pouring that darkness back out onto a crowd and bringing that darkness to them. And if they stare at this darkness, rather than taking, and the Brits do need to take action, they need to take wise, judicious, peaceful action. The Canadians, I know they lost the volley, but they actually made a huge difference in the world with their trucker protest and so-called Operation Bouncy Castle. It was pro-family. It was fun. There were no hooligans. There was nothing rough. And so when the Canadian government victimized them, the Canadian government looked way out of line to the entire world. The same logic always works in these situations. So huge, peaceful, family-oriented protests, songs of patriotism, songs of love, singing Amazing Grace, and these kinds of things in large numbers is far better than they're trying to kill you, and if you don't prepare for war, then you're a sitting duck.
Have you been surprised, disappointed by how few people that have been part of the group pushing back against some of the woke excesses of the past 5 years on all sorts of issues, from the gender issue, COVID, you name it, immigration, are now apparently quite happy to deploy their tactics now that they're kind of in charge?
I wish I could say I was surprised. I was surprised a year ago, but I watched the right veer off, in my opinion, a year ago, and I saw where they were going. And so in this case, I'm not surprised. I'm not happy. It's this weird, grumbling resignation that you kind of have when there seems like there's nothing you can do about it, but you also know it's wrong. But I went through the shock and surprise phase that the right can be just as bad as in tribalism and, unthinking reaction as the people that they were standing up to I already went through all that. And so I'm not surprised. I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. I wish I was a year ago. I was shocked a year ago to watch the right make kind of a heel turn and start marching in a different direction, kind of as one, and utter silence from the so-called, influencers or voices or media apparatchiks and even politicians to the issues that were going on with that. But no, they're just as tribal as everybody else. And when you get tribal, the truth falls out, goodness falls out, and everything becomes about my team. And that's a human thing. And people on the right are human. People on the left are human. And it turns out that it's not that surprising when you have that perspective.
My guess is some people watching this conversation will say, that all sounds very nice, Freddie and James. Kumbaya, let's all sing Amazing Grace. Let's fall back on principles of classical liberalism, obey due process, have strong independent institutions, and hope that these things can be arbitrated in a measured and sober and proper way. Good for you guys for having such ideals, but look around you and it sounds completely out of time. Like we are nostalgics talking about a world that has passed. What they observe are the people who use the language of liberalism actually deployed it in a very forceful and very politicized way in advance of the kind of right-wing counter-revolution. And yes, the right is now doing that because this fanciful world of perfect classical liberalism never existed. We're in a tribal battle, and as far as they're concerned, they just need to win it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the motivation and the impulse, but that's absurd. The world that you and I might be speaking to has not passed. The world that we are speaking to was built and maintained by willful action of citizen after citizen after citizen, plus the institutions that we erect. So it's our call in this moment not to stare around and say everything's tribal, so I must be tribal, but to start re-erecting that civilization. Things have slipped. Things aren't working. This is why I'm saying things like that all of these organizations that actually are acting as terrorists should be identified as such. They should be treated as such, and we should be serious about this where we have not been for over a decade or 2 decades. Things are ugly right now. Things are off track right now, but it's up to us to decide which kind of world we want to live in and hand to our children. Do we want one that is warring tribe against warring tribe, with each one, volleying harder and harder with an escalation that leads obviously into violence? Or do we want one where we say, hold on, no more. We're going to put this back together, and each one of us is going to be part of the solution, which is what it actually takes to put that thing back together. It's not that the world that we had has passed. It's that we must decide we want that world and to work to build that world and to maintain that world generation after generation. There's no choice. There's never been a choice.
Part of that process, I suppose, is trying to be more moderate, trying to exercise restraint, basically, which seems like the most unfashionable notion in politics right now. Restraint is for like losers, gatekeepers, centrists, whatever the word you want to throw. But somehow, if nobody exercises restraint, we're really screwed.
The model of strength, and if you even want masculinity, that is the most impactful is that of firm resolve with restraint. You know exactly how much pressure you have to apply and not more. And no matter how angry you are, no matter where your emotions are, you control them so that you can funnel things into productive building action. And so that's a mark of civilization itself. That is, in fact, the single principle upon which civilization is built out of chaos. And that principle is, I will restrain myself in order to do the right thing, to make things better for myself and those around me, and the communities that I live in the nation that I belong to, and maybe the world at large if it comes to that. Rather than give in to my emotions, rather than seek catharsis, which is a form of release for frustration and anger and despair, but it's also an emotional indulgence. It's an orgasm that comes and goes in a few seconds, and on the other side lies the little death. This is the choice. It is literally civilization, which requires restraining ourselves and channeling and sublimating those urges into productive activity that is firm, that does guard and protect boundaries, but also is judicious, that is, like we keep saying the word, restrained, that is temperate, that is clement, at the same time as being directed, purposeful, and willing to take the necessary action to deal with the circumstances. Or we can pick emotion, satisfaction, retribution, vengeance, chaos. Those are our choices. There are no others.
James, on that peroration, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And we'll see, we'll check in on the comments and see if people are joining the new restraint party or whether that falls by the wayside. We shall see, but thanks for joining.
Thank you for making the time for me, Freddie.
That was James Lindsay, a firebrand, I would say, on X and on social media, someone who is thought of as being kind of a radical and outrageous, talking in astonishingly sober terms there about how he thinks we need to dial it back and try and rediscover a more restrained politics. Well, let us know what you thought in the comments, as ever, whether you're listening on YouTube or as a podcast. But in the meantime, thanks for joining. This was UnHerd.